welcome to everybody who's we're really thrilled. I've got the pleasure of welcoming my guest, Gilly Orr. This is as part of our Inspirational Women Coffee series to talk to, well, women that I know personally and by whom I feel inspired, and I hope you will feel the same after you've listened to Gilly and her career with the BBC as a journalist, and then her move into the charity sector, where she put it rather well. Rather than witnessing global inequality, she now wishes to play a part in addressing it. So, without further ado, Gilly, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about your journey into journalism. How did it all start?
I actually wanted to be a journalist forever, I think. I was an avid diary keeper from a very young age, which I think is important. If you think keeping a record of history, whether it's your own personal history or global history, then I think that marks you out as someone who's interested in what goes on in the world. And I edited the school newspaper, The Insider. There were some really tough interviews with things like the school priest and other key candidates for discussion. And I think really from there, it was always an ambition of mine. And I didn't go down the journalism as an undergraduate degree. In fact, for the interest of this audience, I did a law degree and swiftly realised halfway through the first term that I wasn't a lawyer because I was in a room with lots of people who were lawyers. And I think for me, that really sparked a kind of deeper search into journalism and how it would be a part of my life. Interestingly though, I mean, for me, the way I actually got into it was that travel, which is really another of my passions, and seeing the world and seeing what happens across the world, was one of the things that I was keen to do more of as I finished university. And I planned a road trip with a great friend of mine, and we got in a car and headed off to Italy. And had the most amazing time, and actually ended up in Rome and met a number of people who worked for Vatican Radio, and through a sort of series of coffees, which at the time I hadn't quite realised were sort of job interviews, I ended up being offered a role in reading the news on Vatican Radio. And so my 3-month road trip ended up being 3.5 years in Rome. And working for, unsurprisingly, a totally fascinating organisation. And what a lot of you might not know is that Vatican Radio is actually the 3rd biggest radio station in the world. It is a bit smaller than the BBC and Voice of America. It broadcasts in 40 languages, including Esperanto. And a lot of sort of wonderful services like Hausa, which I tried desperately to learn for 3 years and failed. It's a really tough language, but I mean, just a fascinating cross-section of kind of the global community. And I think what was really important for me, and the reason perhaps I stayed so long, was that they see themselves as the mouthpiece for the oppressed and the marginalized. And so Vatican Radio's view on things was, if there was a war going on, what was happening to the poor people on the ground? Because invariably they're left behind with no defenses to put up with whatever fighting goes on. And so, and what is also great about the Catholic Church is that if there's something going on in the world, there's almost certainly a nun or a priest in the thick of it looking after those people. And so there is always someone to talk to. And so really for me, that began my love of journalism as a career, but it also really highlighted for me the importance in my personal and professional life to really study and serve to fight the sort of causes of inequality. So I started there, and then I came back and sort of slightly embarrassingly to say, I used the entirely unequal route of ringing all of my network to find a job back in the UK, and managed to somehow talk my way into the Today programme, which for the Brits on this, this call is basically the BBC's sort of preeminent news and current affairs programme in the UK, which is listened to by about 7.5 million people every day, including everyone from the kind of Prime Minister and all of his advisors to heads of business, the whole spectrum. And I went from a junior researcher role to being one of the editors of the programme, who, you know, deciding what the nation heard every morning. So that was my sort of career trajectory.
Yeah, well, it's so impressive to hear. And perhaps we could focus just on some of the highlights of your work during your time on the Today programme. I know one of them was the Arab Spring. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I was very lucky because I'm not very good at sitting still. It's something that I find difficult to do, and wanted to go and explore and travel. And I got to be a sort of very privileged position where I was really the kind of roving producer for the programme. And I went all over the world looking at elections, civil unrest, I once studied a herd of goats that live on a mountainside in Wales that like to trot down into town of an evening and terrorise the local population. I mean, you really can do the whole lot as a journalist. But I sort of developed my skills on the road, and when the Arab Spring started, I became the sort of producer that covered the Arab Spring for the programme, and I worked predominantly with one of the presenters, Jim Naughtie, and we pretty much went everywhere. I was in sort of Tahrir Square for at the sort of start of the protests, and got caught up in some fairly hairy moments there. I think one of the interesting things about sort of civil unrest is that if anyone's been to a protest, even just a sort of gentle Western one, there is a kind of constant air of slight uncertainty that number of people and that sort of passion for an issue, whatever it is, can always topple into something a bit more. And given what we're witnessing happening in the US and in the UK and across the world at the moment with the sort of George Floyd protests, I think it's a real reminder that these sorts of things don't just happen. Sorry, telephone calls. These sorts of things don't just happen in faraway places. They happen on your doorstep as well. But the Arab Spring was fascinating because for me, it was, I think, the first tangible sign of what an area that I'm particularly fascinated with, which is generational change. And I think the Arab Spring was the first demonstration of the younger generation, and certainly, Paola, sadly, the generation below us, the millennials and Gen Z, really starting to sort of rise up and make their voices heard. And the Arab Spring across the region was a youth protest movement by and large. I have the great good fortune of really having only one good Egyptian friend, and it transpired that he was bankrolling the revolution and supporting the youth. So every banner that you saw in Tahrir Square was being designed by my friend Dr. Hamza in his architecture practice, and his entire staff were in fact writing those banners, buying the broomsticks and the bed sheets on which they were made, and making sure that they got into the square and that the young people there were fed and watered so that they could maintain their protests. his best friend is a famous Egyptian novelist called Alar al-Aswani, who has always been, in the eyes of the authorities, a bit of trouble because his novels are about oppression and overly strong governments. And I went to record an interview with him and ended up getting caught in a mob, and the car I was in was being rocked from side to side by protesters who had machetes. There were some sabers. There was an extraordinary array of protesters. And I think what was interesting is I ended up getting out of that because Dr. Hamza, my Egyptian friend, who's in his late 60s, or he was then, and he's about 5'5". He's pretty small with wiry hair and a barrel chest. And he leapt out of the car and put his hands on his hips and said, you know, my friends, do you know who we are, who I am? And they all turned and they looked at him and they realized that it was a personal supporter of the protesters, and this great phrase, Pasha, you know, Pasha is a sign of respect in Egypt, and we were allowed through. But there are moments like that quite a lot in these situations, and I think for me, being witness to these events and really being on the ground and talking to people is really important, because in the end, actually, we stopped and we talked to some of the protesters there, and the communication of what's going on in these sorts of environments is so tough. And obviously with the internet, it's much easier to communicate, but even still, the sort of the rumor and the hearsay and the fake news sort of floods around so quickly that, you know, I think one of the reasons that I so enjoyed being a journalist was that actually there's a real power and value in clear communication and making sure that truth gets out. So yeah, the Arab Spring, I've told you another story, Paola, about being in Libya when Gaddafi's palace was sort of broken into, liberated by the people. Gaddafi had fled his palace, and for the first time, you know, real people were allowed to go in and see these incredible, sumptuous palaces. And I mean, again, the Libyans like nothing more than firing guns into the air in celebration, which, you know, as anyone knows about, you know, the power of physics, what goes up must come down. And so there was I in my sort of Kevlar jacket and a hard hat, just convinced that bullets were going to drop on my head. But I mean, luckily not. But, you know, talking to this woman who'd been rooting through the palace and come out with a photo album of sort of young Gaddafi family members in the palace. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And these moments of history are so important. And I think they're important. I think those very everyday moments are almost as important, if not, to me, more important than the bigger picture. I did a piece when we were in Libya on the bin collections. Libya is an incredibly clean country, and there was this rolling, you know, civil unrest across Tripoli and the country, and the bin men were still going around in there with their high-vis jackets on, collecting the rubbish. And I just think that is a sign, you know, of just what humanity is really like. It's about decent people helping the rest of society carry on. So yeah, the Arab Spring was a fascinating time for me.
Well, it sounds like it, and it really sounds like you got that personal insight into what was happening on the ground. And I wonder whether that went some way towards this big change that you made in your life. You know, you were flying high in a career at the BBC, and you decided to move away from that and go and do a master's at the London School of Economics, looking at inequality, and moving into the charity sector where you find yourself now. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that transition and how that has been.
Yeah, so I had a very wonderful a very privileged, sheltered childhood where I had really nothing to worry about. I was well fed, I was loved, I was pampered, I went on nice holidays. And for me, journalism was, news had always been a part of my life, but journalism was the process by which I really got to see the unequalness of society and firsthand bear witness to what goes on. And it happens in Western society just as much as it actually happens overseas. And I think partly in the West, we've become inured to this idea that inequality and problems are an overseas issue, and it allows you to step back and just think that there's nothing you can really do because you're there, it's over there. And the truth is that actually inequality is systemic across the world, and it is something that, you know, happens in all societies. And so I sort of spent over a decade, 15 years in the end, being a journalist and going around the world and seeing all this inequality and realizing by working for a domestic UK news programme that it happened an awful lot in the UK as well. And so I was looking for something tangible that I could do. And as Paola said, I'd spent a lot of time bearing witness, but you see something awful happening and you can't intervene as a journalist. You have to just watch it and report on it. And I wanted to be able to stop and help that person or do that thing. So I actually left and joined a startup working in dementia, which is an issue again that's important in my life. But sadly, the startup didn't quite start up, but that's apparently very good for your CV. So I enjoyed that brief experience. But then actually I was scouting around for a master's degree to do because I felt that it was a good opportunity to go back and study a bit further. And I'd looked at loads when I was trying to leave the BBC and hadn't found anything. And I looked again, and the LSE had just begun an inequalities programme, and it had started a couple of months before I started looking. And interestingly, it's a developed world economies inequality. So it looks, it's a multidisciplinary look at inequality in the developed world economies. And I'd looked at loads and loads of masters, and I saw this one, and instantly I knew it was what I wanted to do. And I was right. It was a fascinating year. I can't recommend it highly enough to people who are interested in going to see that or go and do go back to education. It looked at everything from social policy, history, economics, public policy, and looking really crucially at how intertwined it is. There's this sort of slightly wonky academic phrase, intersectionality, which is this idea that that things intersect. So this idea that you can be subject to one form of inequality, but actually the likelihood is, and what you realize when you study it, is that someone who's subject to inequality, be it on race or gender or disability or education, whatever, you're so likely to also be suffering inequality on another front as well. Most people who struggle with inequality do so on many strata. And I think for me, that was, for someone who still has lived life, you know, had lived a very sheltered life, even with all my travel, to realize that how systemic inequality is in society, that if you struggle with one thing, you're actually going to struggle in all sorts of aspects of life, and that happens in, you know, rich countries like ours. It was for me incredibly eye-opening and you know, saddening. It just strikes me that we in the West think we've solved it, we've got this great society that's worth striving for and preserving as it is. And yet, you know, the truth is that we are, you know, as entrenched with our problems as you know, countries all over the world. And interestingly, you know, I've spoken of travel as being a really important part of my life, but actually I realized after that that there was no requirement for me to go and work for an overseas charity. I really believed that, you know, there was work to be done at home. And so I have, you know, I chose the course of, you know, a UK career after that rather than overseas, which had been something on my mind.
Yeah. When we talk about, well, inequality, part of this discussion is framed in the context also of diversity and inclusion. And so one of the subjects that I'd like us to touch on is when we're talking about, for example, gender diversity and how that has played a role, if at all, in your career. You know, the sorts of women that perhaps you saw as inspirational when you were at the beginning of your career, and in both sectors that you've been in. And now also you yourself now being seen as somebody who's inspirational, who is a mentor, and can give advice to those perhaps starting out. It would be interesting to hear some of your reflections on that.
So I went to a convent school in the middle of nowhere in Britain for 9 years, and my headmistress became headmistress aged 39, I think, and she was a nun, still is, and she's currently head of her order and best mates with the Pope, and she was an inspirational woman. She's from an order of nuns that was called the IBVM, and it's now the Sisters of Jesus. It's the sort of female branch of the Jesuits, and it was set up in the UK in the 1600s by this amazing woman called Mary Ward, who basically thought that women should be able to have an education, and was so held this belief so strongly. And she got pushback from all sorts of parts of UK, British society, including the church, that she walked to Rome to convince the Pope that she should set up an order of nuns that would educate women. And it worked. The order was set up, and they now teach across the world. You know, I would say do a fabulous job. I think what is really, what I realized looking back on my education is that they were really encouraging about education, but it was about character and service to your fellow man that was as crucial a part of that education as you know, any textbook. And I mean, Sister Campion believed that everything could be taught to you, from Winnie the Pooh and the Velveteen Rabbit to marvelous children's books, which really do have some great life lessons. But so much of that is about helping your fellow man. And there was a lot of charity work that we were required to do, well, asked to do, and wholeheartedly joined in. And I think I've been very lucky that, you know, from such an early age, I had, you know, this very impressive female role model. Interestingly, in Rome, there were some impressive women that I worked with at Vatican Radio, but the church itself isn't necessarily that full of female role models, though some of the nuns that run the households in Rome, with all these sort of priests running around, sort of needing to look after her, they're pretty powerful women themselves. But the BBC as an organisation actually is incredibly good on gender diversity, and in fact quite a lot of the senior management are women, and certainly in my opinion some of the best news editors are women, and I put that down to the fact that good journalism is about bearing witness to real life. And, you know, as I said, I always think the small stories are as important as the kind of geopolitical sort of significance of an event. And I do think sometimes women just inherently get that. And I think for news, that kind of humility and that acceptance or understanding that you can only change people's minds and explain to them the significance of a story by showing how it affects real people. So, gender equality in the BBC is still, in terms of sheer numbers, is still a problem. It's something that they address quite a lot. But I've been very lucky that, to have worked with some really inspirational women. And interestingly, the role, I haven't talked about my current job, but I do external affairs and fund development for a social enterprise fund manager, which basically invests money into charities to able to scale them sustainably and safely. And what I have noticed and have pointed out, and we're now about sort of, we're trying to work out what we do with this piece of knowledge, but what we realize is that of all the charities that as a fund manager we've worked with, I've been there 2 years, but the organization as a whole over the last 6 years, the really great charities that we deal with predominantly are led by women, that the senior management teams of good charities are led by women. The ones without problems in our portfolio are led by women. And it's not something we've proactively done anything. We haven't sought to invest in female-led charities, but what we found is that the due diligence process of finding what we as an organisation thinks a good charity looks like invariably means that it's about 70% of our portfolio have female leaders, and so I'm very aware that there's a lot to be done on gender equality in terms of sheer numbers. But I think one of the things I would point out, because I think in the grander scheme of things where the real work still needs to be done, is actually intersectional gender diversity, because actually as a well-educated, relatively affluent white middle-class woman, I actually don't really suffer that much inequality. Society has pretty much dealt with working out how I as a woman get a job, and actually I don't struggle very much. I do in the grand scheme of things, and there are plenty of jobs I applied for and didn't get, but the structures are there to allow me to get through that. And the problem then comes actually, and I think there is a real issue as a middle class, wealthy, Western woman, about thinking that somehow I'm on the right side of the argument, that there's no work for me personally to do. And I think actually there is, I worry that people like me are the most complacent, or are in danger of being the most complacent, just by dint of being a woman. And yet I think, there is so much to be done if you're trying to help women from poor backgrounds, women from Black and ethnic minority communities, women with disabilities. There are many groups of women where the statistics are really still telling you that there is a lot of work to be done. So I think it's sometimes red herring to just look at sheer numbers, gender equality in terms of numbers in an organisation, because I suspect, certainly with the legal world, if you look at the sort of economic and social history of the women in most organisations, they reflect this problem that I'm talking about, i.e. they're all mostly quite like me. And I think that for me is something that my inequality degree sort of taught me to look at, and just to constantly try and see where those kind of intersectional issues lie, and to recognize my own privilege, because I am hugely privileged. And I think being aware of that is really only the first step in being able to help.
Yes, I really like that point, Gilly, and almost if there was a call to action from this discussion that we've had for the last 30 minutes, it would be to recognise when we are in a position actually of privilege, and where perhaps during our careers we've actually been very lucky to be supported, and we've had the right people helping us with our career development, and that perhaps we should be now looking as to where we can play a role in helping others who perhaps may not naturally have those networks and those connections to step in and step up within our own organisations. So I think that's a nice closing thought, but I would like to give our audience, if they would like to do so, a chance to make any comments or ask any questions. I appreciate that we've heard a lot from Gilly, and there's so many questions that we could all ask you. But if anybody would like to make any comments, then we would, of course, welcome those.
Hi,
well,
Paola.
if
I
not,
wanted to say,
hi, Caroline.
Hello, hi, nice to see you. It was a wonderful session. Thank you so much, Gilly. Very inspiring and very thought-provoking and very insightful. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. It's my first time coming to these get-togethers, and it was really enjoyable. Thank you.
I would just say, I mean, I think one of the things that I would add is that I think there is a way of using your privilege positively. And I think we spend a lot of time, I think, protesting and making your voice heard, and writing to, you know, all the things that we as people with privilege can do, which is connect to the people in power, who writing to your MP, all of those sorts of things are hugely valuable, but also looking to your own practices, both at home and really importantly, I think in the context of this session, as in terms of work. So the company I've come into, it's tiny, but unsurprisingly, given the sort of networks of the people who are all quite like me, again, that we end up doing work, giving work experience to a whole load of sort of privileged kids who are friends of friends of friends. And one of the things I'm in the process of setting up is an internship program organised in conjunction with the Social Mobility Foundation in the UK, just to give exposure to young people without networks, because, you know, we're a tiny organisation. No one's ever going to proactively reach out to us without, they're never going to find us to ask for an internship, but we should be going to find young people who would benefit from both the experience of being in our office, but also, you know, meeting and having the connections with people like us. And I think that there are just small things, you know, every day. Being passive is no longer enough. You can no longer just be, you can't no longer not be a racist. You have to be anti-racism, and that is a proactive step. And I think that happens in all parts of our lives. Doing nothing puts you on the wrong side of the argument. And so, you know, think about everything from how you shop to how you know, interact with members of public on the tube. I mean, there is just, there's so much that we can do. And I think it's really important to start at home with our own practices. Also,
thank you. I think there's I think that's a wonderful closing thought to finish on. Before we do go, apart from Caroline, and it's great to have you here, Caroline, and thank you for your intervention. I note that we have a couple of other guests joining us today, so I would just like to acknowledge and thank them. Jenny Selby, it's wonderful to see you here, and also Jan Bart Brinks. So thank you very much for joining us. And well, to all our wonderful AIJA members, it's always great to see your faces here and your contributions to our discussion. And I invite you to join me again next Friday where we're going to hear from Philippa Yude, who is a consultant in gastroenterology and has been at the forefront of the COVID pandemic, as well as a number of other very interesting things that she's done during her career, and I'm really looking forward to talking to her. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, have a lovely weekend, and Gilly, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.